And this is the post-Enlightenment world, where most agreed in Enlightenment principles like equality and freedom and choice. So how in the world do we go from that to taking over the entire continent of Africa? Where's the Enlightenment in those decisions? Welcome to A Popular History of Unpopular Things, a podcast that makes history more accessible. My kind of history is the unpopular stuff: disease, death, and destruction. I like learning about all things bloody, gross, mysterious, and weird. I've been mentioning imperialism in Congo for years at this point, so I think it's about time I finally did that episode on it. During the height of European imperialism in Africa, in the late 19th century, that's the 1800s, 7 countries divided up virtually all of African land to capitalize and control the land, its resources, and the people. Atrocities ensued across the continent. From the more obvious cases, like the Namibian genocide perpetrated by the Germans against the Herero and Nama peoples, and yes, it was a genocide, Germany in 2021 recognized it as such, to the everyday degradations that Africans faced at the behest of their colonial overlords. But perhaps the most brutal example of European imperialism in Africa is the story of the Congo Free State, partly because it wasn't ruled by the country of Belgium. It was, in the beginning, ruled by just one man, Belgium's King Leopold II, and during his control of the Congo Free State from 1885 to 1908, anywhere from 1.5 million to 13 million people died. So in today's episode, we're going to take a look at how and why that happened. First, as we normally do, we'll take a look at the historical context. What was happening in the world that led to the King of Belgium owning over 1 million square miles of land right in the middle of the African continent? That's 2.6 million kilometers square for my non-American audience. Or to put it in other terms, the Congo Free State was 85 times larger than Belgium itself. So once we're clear on how Leopold got control of the Congo, we'll take a look at why he wanted it, what he did there, and some of the atrocities committed in the name of imperialism and industrialization, and money. Then we'll wrap up the story by taking a look at how he lost control of the colony in 1908 and what happened when Belgium took over. So let's get started. For those of you who might be new to the podcast, historical context is one of my favorite things to do, and truthfully, it's one of the most important parts of the craft. It is important to know the context behind an event to truly understand its place in time. So in today's case, how do we end up with one man owning the largest colony in Africa? What events in history led to that? And perhaps even what events in history led to Europeans feeling like they could just claim the land for themselves? This context is going to be a long one today, and I'm probably going to get a bit heated, so just giving you fair warning. This topic always gets me super fired up. Now, the short answer to how did Leopold get the Congo is the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, but I want to go further back to the beginning days of the Atlantic slave trade to really establish the imperial relationship between Europeans and Africans. I will do my best to keep it brief, at least relevant. Columbus, who was sailing west to get to Asia, sailed right into the Caribbean and forever changed communication and trade between the world's civilizations. And as a result, we see the rise of European colonies in what they called the New World. It wasn't new, of course. Settled agricultural civilizations had lived in the Americas as long as those in Afro-Eurasia. But it was new to the Europeans, so they called it the New World, and it kind of stuck. The Spanish were the first to settle colonies as early as 1493, and the Portuguese, British, French, and Dutch soon joined in. And the point of these colonies was primarily to make the Europeans richer. They wanted to own the land and the resources on that land, which they would turn into manufactured goods, or in some cases, they were pulling silver out of mountains, and that would just straight go into the economy. And this is the era where we see sugar becoming the most widely accessible thing, right? We also see greater firearms and alcohol in trade. That's a winning combination. And other plantation crops like tobacco, coffee, cotton, and cocoa. The secondary reason for their widespread colonization was to spread their respective religions. To keep a very long story short and simplified, the aforementioned European countries were in the midst of religious turmoil throughout the entire early modern period, and they were keen on spreading their religion for both dominance and legitimacy. Spain, for example, had the constant looming presence of Islam right underneath it in northern Africa, and after 1517, half of Europe was anti-Catholic and fracturing into different Protestant faiths. 1517 was the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. So part of the religious fervor we see in the colonial period comes from a desire to protect and spread their respective faiths. But anyway, all these new colonies in the New World needed laborers, and unfortunately for the European colonial overlords, they brought with them more than just ships, governments, and lots of weapons. They also brought disease. One in particular is credited with killing anywhere from 50 to 90% of all indigenous Americans: smallpox. As an old world disease, New World populations didn't have any kind of immunity to it, as they had never been exposed to anything like it, and their bodies didn't know how to fight it off. So many died that the Europeans looked to another labor source to work in their American colonies: Africans. Now, slavery in Africa was already established, and it is important to understand that the bulk of enslaved Africans were captured and sold by powerful African kingdoms, like Dahomey and the Ashanti in West Africa, and the Kingdom of Congo, with a K, in Central Africa. Europeans traded for these enslaved men, women, and children in exchange for things like guns, alcohol, and other goods that these slaving kingdoms wanted. And not only did this depopulate Africa of many of its sons and daughters, sending them to a terrible fate across the ocean, but it also had two bigger consequences. It created an economy based on slavery, and it made powerful African kingdoms dependent on European trade for survival. If we look at the Ashanti, for example, around 80% of its economy was based on the slave trade. So think for a moment what would happen if, say, the buying and selling of slaves was abolished? What might happen to the Kingdom of Ashanti's economy? Well, it would completely collapse. And who would be there to sweep in and take over? The European countries who were controlling their economy through trade. So for the Ashanti, that was the British. The British ended the slave trade in 1807, the French followed suit in 1818. To be fair, the French did it for a hot minute during the French Revolution, but it was later revived by Napoleon to raise funds for his expensive wars. But in 1818, it was over. Now, to be clear, again, this was the end to the buying and selling of slaves, not necessarily the use or owning of slaves. But for the powerful African kingdoms who relied on slave trading with Europeans for their survival, it meant their downfall. And in the period after slave trading was abolished by the British, instead, the Ashanti had to deal with British encroachment on their lands. And the same thing happens with the Kingdom of Congo, with a K, a little bit closer to the subject of today's story, but with the Portuguese. They are different. I'm just putting it out there. The Kingdom of Congo and the Congo, just technically a little bit different. And in this way, the Europeans went from having trade ports on the coast through which they traded with African kingdoms to slowly taking over more and more African land. And by 1884, Europeans controlled around 10% of Africa, primarily on the coast still. But that was about to change with the Berlin Conference. Between 1884 and 1885, 7 European nations with land and interest in Africa met in Berlin to discuss the fate of the continent. Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Belgium. And as Adam Hochschild noted in his incredible and very important book, King Leopold's Ghost, quote, "Contrary to the myth, the Berlin Conference did not partition Africa. The spoils were too large, and it would take many more treaties to divide them all." End quote. But in general, if we simplify things, the Berlin Conference was the seminal point where the fate of Africa would change forever. And there were no Africans at the conference at all. Just Europeans eager to divvy up the land and take what they wanted. So, let's pause and regroup here. I know that was a lot of history, but it is all really important to the story. And it's not even everything. That was the simplified version. But I do have some questions to help guide the rest of this. Why Africa? Were they not satisfied with what they already took from the Americas? And why is this happening in the late 19th century and not earlier, when some of the aforementioned countries abolished the slave trade? Or, in other words, why that particular moment in time? And finally, to bring us back on track, how did Leopold the man get a giant chunk of land and not Belgium, his government? Let's start with the first question. Why Africa? Wasn't the entire North-South American continent enough? Well, to keep this one brief, also, it wasn't enough anymore, because almost all of the colonies in the Americas had, by the time of the Berlin Conference, fought for and earned their independence from their European colonial overlords. It started with the United States in 1776, which then encouraged the French Revolution in 1789, which triggered the Haitian Revolution in 1791, which later influenced the various Central and South American revolutions, most of which had wrapped up by 1836. Not all. We know that the Spanish still controlled Puerto Rico and Cuba until we defeated them in the Spanish-American War, right? And some countries, like French Guiana, remain colonies to this day. But the bigger point is that the Americas, for the most part, were no longer colonies owned, operated, and exploited by Europeans, at least not in the same way. So, second question then. Why the late 19th century? If the various American colonies were lost by the mid-19th century, then what was the impetus to only start a proper land grab in Africa in the 1880s? And for that, let's discuss the Industrial Revolution. Historians generally agree that the Industrial Revolution began in Britain in the mid-18th century, that's the 1700s, and by the late 19th century, the late 1800s, it had spread throughout Europe and America. But with this influx of new machines, inventions, and ideas, there arose a new need, a new resource required for machines and industry to function: rubber. In 1839, Charles Goodyear, yes, Goodyear as in the tire company, invented the process of vulcanization, which allowed natural rubber, which is a sap from the Hevea brasiliensis tree, to withstand the intense heat and pressure applied to it in machining. And the rubber, of course, is necessary for machines to function. I mean, without an O-ring, forget it. No tight seals anywhere. And you can't have leaking machines, right? That's all kinds of problems. So the Industrial Revolution necessitated the harvest of rubber latex from rubber trees. So where does one find rubber trees? Well, the Brasiliensis trees are native to rainforests, specifically and originally in South America. But as I already mentioned, South American countries had gained their independence right around the time that Goodyear perfected his process of vulcanizing rubber so it can be used properly in industry. And so, European colonial powers were eager to establish rubber plantations in other areas within their control, which included parts of Africa. And do you know where there's another massive rainforest in the world outside of South America? The middle of Africa. Let's rewind a bit. Beginning in the 1840s, a man named David Livingstone set out to explore the unexplored areas of Africa. I had mentioned that Europeans occupied about 10% of Africa before the Berlin Conference, and most of that was on the coast. So the middle of the continent was, to them, a big question mark. Who lived there? What was out there? Were there any magical raw materials that might change the face of industry forever? Like, what if they found a giant mountain of something like vibranium, right? Now, the possibilities were endless, and David Livingstone was dead set on finding out. As Adam Hochschild notes, quote, "All of these European impulses toward Africa, anti-slavery zeal, the search for raw materials, Christian evangelism, and sheer curiosity were embodied in one man, David Livingstone. Physician, prospector, missionary, explorer, he wandered across Africa for 3 decades, starting in the early 1840s. He searched for the source of the Nile, denounced slavery, found Victoria Falls, looked for minerals, and preached the gospel. As the first white man to cross the continent from coast to coast, he became a national hero in Britain." End quote. And though Livingstone fell in love with Africa, unfortunately, the things he discovered there only encouraged the eventual imperialism that befell the continent. But it wasn't just Livingstone. We also need to talk about American journalist Henry Stanley. While out on another expedition, Livingstone went for years without anyone hearing from him, and he was a pretty famous dude, so Henry Stanley was sent out there to find him. In 1871, Stanley and around 190 men set off across the continent to find Livingstone, reporting on his journey with melodrama and hero narratives the entire time. And he does eventually find Livingstone, and that's where we get that famous line, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume?" which may or may not have actually been spoken. We don't have a lot of corroborating stories here, so we got to take that one with a grain of salt. But the combination of Livingstone's journey and Stanley's reporting really opened up the interior of Africa. It was no longer a gray splotch on a European map, unknown and mysterious to those living outside of it. It was charted, and it generated interest, especially since men like Stanley and those who came after him described Africa as a, quote, unpeopled country. He wrote, "What a settlement one could have in this valley. See, it is broad enough to support a large population. Fancy a church spire rising where that tamarind rears its dark crown of foliage, and think how well a score or two of pretty cottages would look instead of those thorn clumps and gum trees. There are plenty of pilgrim fathers among the Anglo-Saxon race yet, and when America is filled up with their descendants, who shall say that Africa shall not be their next resting place?" End quote. Gross. I'll talk about European justification for imperialism in just a moment, but Henry Stanley's quote there offers a quick insight into what they thought, that Africa was empty and that white Western Europeans, particularly Americans in his case, should settle there and turn it into just another Western European colony, just like they did with the Americas. And in these dense rainforests of what would become the Congo Free State, there was the potential for rubber plantations, and therefore the potential to make a lot of money in this hot new commodity, which was absolutely necessary for the industrial world. But before we get to how King Leopold, the man not the country, maneuvered himself into owning the largest chunk of the African rainforest, I have just another question here. Earlier in that same century, Europeans had abolished the slave trade, right? Abolitionists everywhere decried the practice. And this is the post-Enlightenment world, where most agreed in Enlightenment principles like equality and freedom and choice, and that man shouldn't live under tyranny. So how in the world do we go from that to taking over the entire continent of Africa, exploiting it for its resources like rubber, but also luxury goods like ivory, and killing tens of millions of Africans in the process? Where's the Enlightenment in those decisions? How can you rationalize freedom and equality for some, but clearly not all? Well, let's talk about their justifications for imperialism. And again, this part always makes me really heated, so I apologize if I start getting agitated. Now, Europeans are there because they want money. Well, they want land, but land is money. And to maximize their profits, they want to take the land for themselves and have the people do the work. But in an age where slavery and exploitation is seen as wrong, there needs to be a different way of marketing what was really happening. And that's where we see the idea of paternalism come into play. There's a great political cartoon I used to use in the classroom called The White Man's Burden, named, of course, after the Rudyard Kipling poem of the same name. Few notes on that, actually. Rudyard Kipling you may recognize as the author of The Jungle Book. He was born in British India, and many of his works are influenced by his time growing up there. But perhaps his most famous poem, The White Man's Burden, was actually written in 1899, which is after the Berlin Conference. And though it's typically used to explain European rationale for imperialism in Africa, the poem is actually not even about Africa or India. It was written about U.S. imperialism in the Philippines and why the U.S. should do that. But the poem and the political cartoon, though not expressly about the Congo or even more broadly African imperialism, it echoes the same paternalist concept, that Africans need the Europeans to control them because otherwise they would be lost. Even saying that out loud makes me angry. Okay, let's look at the political cartoon, and I'll describe it for those of you listening. We've got two figures scaling a rocky mountain. At the top of the mountain, in the background, is a woman who represents civilization. The first figure is John Bull, which is a national personification for England. Our version in America is also in the image. It's Uncle Sam, right? And on their backs, John Bull and Uncle Sam are carrying some incredibly racist caricatures of different countries. Britain is carrying South Africa, China, Egypt, and India, while the US is carrying the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Hawaii, all American colonies and territories when this cartoon was drawn in 1899, same as the poem. And the rocks that John Bull and Uncle Sam are clambering over are labeled cruelty, vice, slavery, ignorance, brutality, and cannibalism. So the message that we're supposed to take from this is that the US and Britain are carrying these nations on their backs to civilization, rescuing them from perceived backwardness. The poem essentially says the same thing. Here are the opening lines from Rudyard Kipling's White Man's Burden, which again is actually about the US colonizing the Philippines, but the argument's the same. Quote, "Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness, on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught, sullen peoples, half devil and half child." So, essentially, it's the white man's burden to send their best and brightest across the world, bringing these half-devil, half-childlike heathens to civilization because it's better for them. That's the gist of the poem. And the worst part is that this worked. Now, if you were to frame imperialism as, hey, they have land, and we can take it and exploit the land and its natural resources and its people to make more money and grow more powerful, then perhaps public opinion in the enlightened world would turn against you, right? But if you repackage it as, hey, these people are living in poverty, and they're backwards, and they're cannibals, and they can't run their own countries, and they need us to come in and control things so that they too, maybe, one day, can be civilized like we are, so let's go teach them about the Word of God. This package is it's more accepted, right, than the simple truth of imperialism. So cue a ton of missionary expeditions and settlements and eventually complete control over practically the entire continent. And again, the White Man's Burden poem and cartoon were published after the continent had virtually been taken over by Europeans. But again, it does a good job illustrating the justification for it. And that just kills me. It's based on such a racist set of ideals. The perception that everyone should look like the white industrial Western world is just wrong. One group of people is not inherently better than another. So the presumption that it is the white man's burden to civilize those that they deemed different by their own standards, it just angers me to no end. Not everyone was duped by this racist pretense for the complete Western imperial takeover of Africa and later Asia. Famous author Mark Twain was an outspoken critic of imperialism, and in 1901 he wrote an anti-imperialism piece called "To the Person Sitting in Darkness," which was a reference poking at Matthew 4:16, "The people who sat in darkness have seen a great light," which is a line used by missionaries to justify those they deemed as heathens and uncivilized. It's an indictment against imperial governments exploiting both land and peoples for their own economic gain, all in the name of morality and civilization. So not everyone fell for the justification for imperialism, but it was enough, at least for a while, to keep the public in favor of what was happening in Africa. But let's focus now on King Leopold himself. Perhaps people with their morality stirred with the white man's burden and missionary work throughout the world could understand their government intervening to help these people, even though that wasn't really what was happening. But how did King Leopold take control of what he called the Congo Free State? How did that even happen? As Adam Hochschild notes in his book, quote, "The Congo Free State, as it was called then, was the huge territory in Central Africa that is the world's only colony claimed by one man. That man is King Leopold II of Belgium, a ruler much admired throughout Europe as a philanthropic monarch. He has welcomed Christian missionaries to his new colony. His troops, it is said, have fought and defeated local slave traders who preyed on the population, and for more than a decade, European newspapers have praised him for investing his personal fortune in public works to benefit the Africans." End quote. But as we already know, that's not why Europeans were there. Missionary work, civilizing the local populations, that was the justification for going. And sure, some people did go there to missionize and try to help. But that wasn't the main reason, right? So why did Leopold want the Congo? And behind that facade of helping the people, what was really going on? Leopold inherited a relatively small country of Belgium, roughly half the size of West Virginia, as Hochschild puts it. And for leaders like King Leopold and many, many others throughout history, one way to establish power and authority was through territorial expansion. But Europe was already chock-a-block with countries, and the continent was only just recovering from the Napoleonic Wars earlier that century, so Leopold couldn't get more land for Belgium in Europe. So, like everyone else, he looked abroad. I mean, why not? Britain's doing it, France is doing it, Belgium can do it too. He tried to work with the Khedives ruling Egypt to build an economic link, even investing in the Suez Canal Company. He tried to buy lakes in the Nile Delta, with the idea of draining them and building a colony. He wanted to buy Abyssinia, which is modern-day Ethiopia and Eritrea, for around 30,000 francs, so it was clear that he wanted to expand his territory for power and clout. Negotiating for the Congo was not his first attempt at getting land. He, like others in Europe, closely followed along with the exploits of Livingstone and Stanley, and seeing an opportunity for a colony in Africa, the lands that many Europeans considered empty, he decided to host a conference of explorers and geographers to talk about the potential in their southern neighboring continent. And as Hochschild notes, quote, "Only in Africa could Leopold hope to achieve his dream of seizing a colony, especially one immensely larger than Belgium. There was no more unclaimed territory in the Americas, nor were there blank spots in Asia. Only Africa remained." End quote. So in 1876, he put together a geographical conference in Brussels that attracted 13 Belgians and 24 foreigners, famous explorers who had seen Africa firsthand and had knowledge of its potential. Humanitarians were there too, impressing on the need for Europeans to get in there and civilize the place. Again, heavy air quotes on the word civilize because the whole premise is just frustrating. And here's some of King Leopold's opening speech from that conference. Quote, "To open to civilization the only part of our globe which it has not yet penetrated, to pierce the darkness which hangs over entire peoples, is, I dare say, a crusade worthy of this century of progress." End quote. And as you can tell, it just echoes the idea that the white man's burden in bringing civilization to the areas of the globe they considered to be uncivilized is what should be going on. But in running this conference, and from his attempts to buy colonies before it, Leopold realized that to get the land he wanted, he would have to do so under the guise of humanitarianism. And to make this work, he knew he'd have to work with somebody with intimate knowledge of the continent, and who shared his ambitions to colonize it. And that man was Henry Stanley. After Henry Stanley returned from an African expedition in 1878, King Leopold invited him to visit Belgium, and the two together decided on the Congo. Stanley would return to Africa, working for King Leopold, and start setting up infrastructure. First a road, and then a railroad, and this would give Leopold the ability to then set up a colony, and other than getting paid for his work, Stanley could also write a book about his endeavors and make money that way. And so began Leopold's early start in the Congo. And in the Congo, Leopold primarily originally wanted ivory, which is a luxury good still in high demand that could fetch a high price. But of course, the whole mission had to be framed through a humanitarian lens, so as not to turn public opinion against what he was doing in the Congo. Stanley remained in the Congo for 5 years, working for Leopold, setting up infrastructure and towns. Leopoldville was the name of his growing capital, which today is Kinshasa, the capital of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So by the time the Berlin Conference rolled around in 1884, the land already very much belonged to King Leopold. He was already in there, building a colony, employing men to set up infrastructure and claim it for himself. And for the Africans who already lived there, with their own domains, who ruled over their land, Leopold worked with them, having them sign treaties to give up their land without them really understanding all that nonsensical legalese or the French words on the document. It was really shifty work. It's basically taking the land out from underneath them, and all of the countries did it. The Brits, the French, they all did it. So with everything lined up, King Leopold started staking his claim over the Congo, politically maneuvering around the other European imperial powers so they wouldn't notice quite how much land he was claiming for himself. Because Leopold was not the only one looking to take African land. As Hochschild notes, quote, "In Europe, the thirst for African land had become nearly palpable. There were some conflicting claims to be resolved, and clearly some ground rules were needed for further division of the African cake. Bismarck offered to host a diplomatic conference in Berlin to discuss some of these issues. End quote. And by the end of that Berlin conference, Leopold walked out with control over the Congo. And because he had started his humanitarian efforts there as a personal project with Henry Stanley, not in the name of creating a colony for Belgium, the Congo Free State remained his personal property. And without Belgian control or oversight, Leopold was able to commit all kinds of horrors on his people in the pursuit of Congo's riches in both ivory and rubber. Perhaps the best way to get right into it is to hear from someone who visited and saw those atrocities firsthand. George Washington Williams was among a group of Americans to come and visit Leopold's colony. He was there because he had heard, like everyone else who read the news, that Leopold was creating a paradise there, that he was bringing civilization to the African populations now under his control, educating them, bringing them religion, doing all the humanitarian things he said he was going to do. But of course, that is not what Williams found. He wrote, "An open letter to His Serene Majesty Leopold II, King of the Belgians and Sovereign of the Independent State of Congo, by Colonel the Honorable G.O.W. Williams of the United States of America in 1890. Don't you just love, old titles of things? They're always way too long. Anyway, Williams wasn't actually a colonel, but not as important. Here are some excerpts from this incredible primary source of what he saw with his own eyes in Leopold's Congo Free State. It afforded me great pleasure to avail myself of the opportunity afforded me last year of visiting your state in Africa, and how thoroughly I have been disenchanted, disappointed, and disheartened. When I arrived in the Congo, I naturally sought for the results of the brilliant program, fostering care, benevolent enterprise, an honest and practical effort to increase the knowledge of the natives and secure their welfare. I had never been able to conceive of Europeans establishing a government in a tropical country without building a hospital, and yet there is not a solitary hospital for Europeans, and only 3 sheds for sick Africans in the service of the state, not fit to be occupied by a horse. There is not a single chaplain in the employ of your Majesty's government to console the sick or bury the dead. I was anxious to see what extent the natives had adopted the fostering care of your Majesty's benevolent enterprise, but they everywhere complain that their land has been taken from them by force, that the government is cruel and arbitrary. Your Majesty's government has sequestered their land, burned their towns, stolen their property, enslaved their women and children, and committed other crimes too numerous to mention in detail. There has been, to my absolute knowledge, no honest and practical effort made to increase their knowledge and secure their welfare. They eat their rice twice a day by the use of their fingers. They often thirst for water when the season is dry. They are exposed to the heat and rain, and sleep upon the damp and filthy decks of the vessels often so closely crowded as to lie in human ordure. And of course, many die. There are from 60 to 70 officers of the Belgian army in the service of your Majesty's government in the Congo, of whom about 30 are at their post. Many of these officers are too young and inexperienced to be entrusted with the difficult work of dealing with native races. They are ignorant of native character, lack wisdom, justice, fortitude, and patience. They have estranged the natives from your Majesty's government, have sown the seed of discord between tribes and villages, and some of them have stained the uniform of the Belgian officer with murder, arson, and robbery. Washington then goes on to levy 12 charges against Leopold and his government, including the following, and I'm just going to summarize the worst of it in a list. Allowing brutal conflicts between indigenous peoples, selling slaves to be eaten by the Congolese, not having enough soldiers there to help make things better, and in fact employing men who engage in acts of cruelty against the Congolese people, including things like, sublist, chaining them up. Washington writes, quote, "Often these ox chains eat into the necks of the prisoners and produce sores about which the flies circle, aggravating the running wound, so the prisoner is constantly worried. These poor creatures are frequently beaten with a dried piece of hippopotamus skin called a chicote, and usually the blood flows at every stroke when well laid on." Back to the list. Selling women as property to white officers first, then the men, and any children born out of that relationship are also considered property. Restricting the ivory trade so that if any Congolese people sell to anyone other than the state, they're punished by having their villages burned. Engaging in slave trading, waging war against the natives, and like a whole bunch more stuff. Now, he finishes his open letter with, quote, "Against the deceit, fraud, robberies, arson, murder, slave raiding, and general policy of cruelty of your Majesty's government to the natives stands their record of unexampled patience, long-suffering, and forgiving spirit, which put the boasted civilization and professed religion of your Majesty's government to the blush. During 13 years, only one white man has lost his life by the hands of the natives, and only 2 white men have been killed in the Congo. All the crimes perpetrated in the Congo have been done in your name, and you must answer at the bar of public sentiment for the misgovernment of a people whose lives and fortunes were entrusted to you by the August Conference of Berlin 1884 to 1885. So, to summarize, Leopold claimed he would continue his humanitarian efforts in the Congo Free State, but really he just encouraged more war and violence, didn't make any attempts to better their lives with education or healthcare or any kind of state services, underemployed soldiers or any kind of policing force, and some of those he did employ committed their own atrocities. But perhaps the most egregious thing, and what the world saw of the Belgian Congo, are the horrors inflicted upon newly enslaved workers who did not collect enough rubber or ivory. And those were showed to the world through the photography of Alice Seeley Harris, a missionary who focused the human rights abuses happening in Leopold's Congo Free State with her photography. And through her work, these photos have become immensely famous because they show men, women, and children missing limbs. Most commonly, their hands. Severing hands was deliberate policy. Charles Lemaire, who was a commissioner working in the Equator District, wrote the following after his retirement. Quote, "During my time in the Congo, I wrote to the government, 'To gather rubber in the district, one must cut off hands, noses, and ears.'" End quote. And if a village refused, the soldiers would sometimes kill the entire village to make an example out of them. And it didn't help that, according to Hochschild, each cartridge issued to the soldiers could only be used to kill someone, not wasted by hunting. So the standard proof that they were using their bullets to kill someone was in presenting the right hand from the corpse of the guy they killed. But sometimes they would chop off the hands of the living, too. Hochschild quotes an officer in saying that, "Sometimes soldiers shot a cartridge at an animal in hunting. They then cut off a hand from a living man." End quote. And Alice Harris captured some of this on film, a relatively new invention that would revolutionize print media. Now, no amount of covering up or political maneuvering could hide what Leopold was really doing in the deep, dark rainforest of his Congo Free State. People were visiting and writing about what they saw, and now people could see it with their own eyes through photography. It was a rubber terror. A Catholic priest recorded oral histories of some of those who endured these heinous years under Leopold, and one man spoke about an official named Leon Fives. Quote, "All the blacks saw this man as the devil of the equator. From all the bodies killed in the field, you had to cut off the hands. He wanted to see the number of hands cut off by each soldier, who had to bring them in baskets. A village which refused to provide rubber would be completely swept clean. As a young man, I saw a soldier take a big net, put 10 arrested natives in it, attach stones to the net, and make it tumble into the river. Rubber caused these torments. That's why we no longer want to hear its name spoken. Soldiers made young men kill or assault their own mothers and sisters." End quote. And the list of atrocities goes on and on and on, but I think you get the point. Leopold wanted a colony all for himself, for power, for prestige. His inherited country, Belgium, was small, and in an era of industrialization and imperialism, he saw the opportunity to take what he wanted. He did so intelligently, under the false guise of humanitarianism, but in professing his want to help the people, and in creating this false narrative of saving the people now under his control, he accidentally brought those who were curious to see what that might look like. And once word got out about what he was really doing there, in both print and visual media, it was made clear to the world that he had no intention of helping the people. He instead enslaved them, exploited them, murdered somewhere in the number of tens of millions of them, all to turn a profit with ivory and rubber. And once the world knew what was really happening in his personal Congo Free State, they took action. Both inside and outside the Congo Free State, people were clamoring for King Leopold to give up control of the territory. Within the Congo, there were rebellions against the brutal treatment they faced, and outside, there were those who agreed with George Washington Williams that what had happened was abhorrent and completely at odds with what Leopold professed he was doing. And as more and more stories and photos appeared from those who had seen these horrors firsthand, the more the world started to discuss what became the Congo question. What to do about King Leopold's administration over his private lands in the heart of the African continent. One example can be seen in 1903 with a man named Edmund Dean Morel. Morel was a key figure in the movement to expose to the world the atrocities happening in the Congo. After years of hard work, he managed to put the Congo question out to the British public, and from there it went to the House of Commons, which unanimously passed a resolution that the Congo indigenous should be governed with humanity. It may not sound huge, but this is now a government essentially condemning the treatment of the Congolese people at the hands of another head of state, which was a huge blow to Leopold. And I'm sure it was also a calculated political move. What more might Britain take if they take down Leopold's territory, right? But that's not the point of today's story. But the declaration certainly made a difference. As Hochschild notes, Leopold was alarmed. Britain was the superpower of the day and the most prominent colonial power in Africa. If it turns the full force of its influence against the Congo state, his profits would be at risk. End quote. As more and more reports from men like E.D. Morel came out, Europe was faced with the Congo question, and it could no longer be ignored. There was a full-blown extermination going on in Central Africa. Pictures of villages burned to the ground, of mutilated bodies, entirely empty towns that were once vibrant and filled with people. It was horrific, and it still is. Millions of people died from the brutality of harsh labor conditions enforced upon them for the rubber and ivory trade. And when we consider factors like murder, starvation, exhaustion, exposure, disease, and a rapidly declining birth rate, then we get a startling figure. Again, the estimate is around 10 million people dead, which was about half the population of the Congo in the period when Leopold first had Henry Stanley laying infrastructure for his eventual takeover to the time that he lost the colony. And though they may not have had a number yet, Europe knew that they had to act. If they didn't, their colonies might be in danger of rebellion as well, and they certainly didn't want that. So in the end, the Belgian government bought the Congo from Leopold in March 1908. It wasn't the end of the rubber and ivory trade. That would still continue to help pay for some of the debts and monies that would go to Leopold as part of the terms of the deal. But at least Leopold no longer had complete, unfettered control over a giant chunk of land in the Congo where, I'll say it again, around 10 million Congolese men, women, and children died as a direct result of Leopold's actions and policies. And it was only about a year and a half later, in December 1909, that King Leopold died, likely of stomach cancer, at the age of 74. Things would still be difficult for the Congolese people, now living in the newly renamed Belgian Congo. It gained its independence along with the majority of African nations only in 1960, and it is still plagued with violence and conflict to this day, for a multitude of reasons, but no doubt many of them stemming from the violence of its past and of the decolonization effort. But the story of the Belgian Congo is a cautionary one. It tells us of the dangers of imperialism, of having one man with unbridled and unchecked control over another group of people. It shows us the negatives of presuming that people should live one way, in this case, the so-called enlightened world of Western Europe in the late 19th century. And it shows us the lengths that some will go to for power and control. An entire population of Congolese people were subjected to horrific displays of violence and brutality, Also, Leopold could profit immensely from the rubber trees brought to their rainforest and the ivory from their elephant populations around Africa. And that's a whole thing, too. The environmental impact this had, as well as the impact on animal species. So when we look at countries today marked by violence, sometimes it helps to consider the historical context. We can't 100% blame one man from the 19th century for what's happening in Congo today, but he certainly made his mark, and his actions changed the future of the Congo and the Congolese people forever. Thanks for joining me for this episode of A Popular History of Unpopular Things. My name is Kelli Beard, and I hope you've enjoyed the story of the Belgian Congo. Thank you for supporting my podcast, and if you haven't already checked out my other episodes, go have a listen. You can also support me and the show on Patreon. Just look up A Popular History of Unpopular Things, subscribe to App Out on YouTube, and check out Nedrick, the musician who created the song you're hearing right now. Links for all that, along with any sources used, are in the description. Be sure to follow my podcast, available wherever you listen, so you know when new episodes are dropped. And stay tuned to get a popular history of unpopular things.